Hey guys, tonight we are peeling back the romanticised veneer of medieval England. You know, the one with all the knights in shining armour and damsels in distress, and we're going to slip into the muddy, calloused shoes of a common criminal. Imagine yourself, just for a moment, not as a hero of yore, but as someone trying to get away with something naughty. You're standing in the heart of what looks like a quaint rustic village. Smoke curls lazily from thatched roofs, the smell of wood smoke and, well, less pleasant farmyard aromas fill the air. It seems peaceful, almost idyllic. But beneath that surface, a relentless, inescapable web of eyes is watching your every move. You probably think you're clever, that you've got a plan. Let me just say, your chances of lasting even a single day without getting caught are, to put it mildly, hilariously slim. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to see where you're all tuning in from tonight, so drop your city or country and your local time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see how far these little nighttime rambles reach. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've just committed your first, perhaps rather minor transgression. Maybe you've swiped a plump chicken from a neighbour's coop, or perhaps you've liberated a few tools from the blacksmith when he wasn't looking. Nothing too dramatic, you think? A crime of opportunity. You're feeling a bit smug, a bit like a medieval Robin Hood, except, you know, you're keeping the loot for yourself. But here's your first and arguably biggest hurdle. You live in what is essentially a human panopticon. Privacy, as you understand it, simply doesn't exist. Your quaint little village isn't a collection of isolated homesteads. It's a tight-knit, interwoven community where everyone knows everyone else's business, often better than they know their own. Think about the layout. Your house, probably a 1 or 2 room affair made of wattle and daub, that's woven sticks plastered with mud, dung and clay, is crammed in cheek by jowl with others. The walls are thin, laughably so. A raised voice, a persistent cough, even an enthusiastic snore can travel. Forget soundproofing. You'd be lucky if your wall kept out a determined draft, let alone the prying ears of your neighbours. Dame Agnes next door? She knows you argued with your spouse last Tuesday about the price of ale, and she certainly heard when you stubbed your toe violently yesterday morning. It's not malicious necessarily, it's just proximity. The fields where most of the village toils are typically run on an open field system. This means large, unenclosed tracts of land are divided into narrow strips, with different families farming adjacent plots. So, when you're out there, supposedly tending your cabbages, you're surrounded. John is ploughing his strip to your left, William is weeding his to your right, and a gaggle of children are probably chasing a stray pig through the fallow land nearby, their eyes missing nothing. If you were to say, bury your stolen goods, you'd need an audience of precisely 0, which is a statistical improbability in broad daylight. And at night? Well, venturing out suspiciously after dark is a surefire way to get noticed. Good luck explaining why you were digging by moonlight without a very convincing story about looking for exceptionally nocturnal earthworms. Then there's the sheer interconnectedness of daily life. The village well isn't just a source of water, it's the medieval equivalent of the office water cooler, a central hub for gossip and information exchange. The women fetching water, the men stopping for a drink after a morning in the fields. They talk. They see who's looking furtive, who's wearing a new tunic they couldn't possibly afford, who's suddenly avoiding eye contact. Remember that chicken you pilfered? Its absence will be noted within hours, and the discussion at the well will soon turn to who was seen loitering near the coop with a suspiciously feathery bulge under their cloak. It's like a real-life social media feed, but with more dysentery and less cat videos. Even children are part of this surveillance network. They're everywhere, underfoot, playing their games. Games that often involve mimicking adult life and, by extension, observing it intently. Little Timmy might not understand the full implications of seeing you sneak out of Master Fletcher's shed with a new saw, but he'll certainly chatter about it to his mother, who will then discuss it with her friends and so on. Your secret is about as safe as a snowman in a heat wave. One of the core structures ensuring this mutual oversight was the tithing system, a rather ingenious bit of Anglo-Saxon social engineering that persisted well into the medieval period. Men over the age of 12 were typically grouped into tithings, usually consisting of 10 men, who were all mutually responsible for each other's conduct. If one member of the tithing committed a crime and absconded, the others could be fined or held accountable. This meant your neighbours weren't just nosy. They had a vested financial interest in your good behaviour. It's a powerful deterrent when you know that your 9 closest male neighbours are effectively your parole officers, except they also share your ale and borrow your tools. Historians still argue whether this system was primarily a tool for maintaining genuine local peace, or an instrument for asserting royal authority down to the lowest levels of society. And let's not forget the alehouse. Oh, the alehouse. A beacon of light, warmth, and semi-potable fermented beverages in a world where water could be downright treacherous. But it's also a place where tongues are loosened by drink, and boasts, confessions, or suspicious whispers can easily be overheard. You flash a bit too much coin after your supposed crime, buying rounds for your mates. Noted. You get drunk and mumble something about easy pickings. Definitely noted. Someone will remember your uncharacteristic generosity or your veiled comments the next morning, especially when news of a local theft starts to circulate. It's a classic blunder, really. Celebrating your ill-gotten gains in the most public place in the village, second only to the church. You might think you could simply lie low, act normal. But normal is a well-established pattern in a medieval village. Any deviation, suddenly being flush with cash, owning a new item you can't account for, even a change in your usual routine, is a red flag. If you usually spend your evenings grumbling by your own hearth, and suddenly you're out and about looking shifty, people notice. If you're known for being poorer than a church mouse and you're suddenly sporting a new pair of shoes, questions will be asked, albeit perhaps not directly to your face at first. The whispers, though, will be deafening. A quirky tidbit from some localities is the existence of bylaws against eavesdropping, or punishments for being a common scold, which often meant someone who gossiped too much or stirred up trouble with their tongue. The irony, of course, is that the entire system of local justice and social cohesion relied heavily on exactly this kind of informal information sharing. They made rules against the very thing that kept their world turning. It's like trying to ban breathing in a yoga class. Good luck with that. So, there you are. Your crime, however small, has been committed. You think you've been clever, covering your tracks. But the truth is, you've been performing on a stage with a highly attentive, deeply interconnected audience. Every villager is a potential witness, every shared glance a potential accusation. The air itself seems to thrum with unspoken suspicion. You haven't even encountered a constable or a sheriff yet, but the invisible walls of village scrutiny are already closing in. The silence of your neighbours might feel more unnerving than outright accusation, as you try to decipher who knows what, who's watching you right now from that shadowy doorway, or from behind that poorly glazed window. The pressure mounts, not from iron bars, but from 100 pairs of familiar eyes. The first inkling that your carefully laid, or perhaps hastily improvised criminal plans are unravelling doesn't come in the form of a stern-faced official knocking at your door. Oh no, it's far more primal, far more immediate, and infinitely more terrifying than that. It starts with a shout. A single, piercing cry from the victim of your misdeed. "Stop, thief!" Or perhaps a more colourful, less PG-13 local equivalent. And this isn't just an isolated yelp of frustration that fades into the general hubbub of village life. This is a trigger. This is the signal that unleashes one of the most effective and frankly alarming features of medieval law enforcement, the hue and cry. Suddenly the seemingly peaceful village you were trying to blend into erupts. It's like kicking a particularly aggressive anthill. That shout is echoed, picked up by anyone and everyone within earshot. "Thief! Thief!" The words ripple outwards, and with them, the entire able-bodied populace of the village, men, women, even older children, are legally obligated to stop whatever they're doing and join the pursuit. Yes, obligated. Failure to join the hue and cry when it was raised could, and often did, result in a fine for the entire village. So it wasn't just civic duty, it was a collective financial imperative. Imagine your modern-day neighbours, the ones you barely exchange a nod with, suddenly dropping their lawnmowers and lattes to form an impromptu, highly motivated posse because someone yelled their car was being broken into. It's that, but with pitchforks and a lot more shouting. You, the perpetrator, are now faced with the immediate and visceral reality of an entire community turning into a single, furious organism whose sole purpose is your capture. There's no calm deliberation. No, let's wait for the authorities. It's instantaneous. The farmer drops his hoe. The baker abandons his loaves. The housewife leaves her stew simmering. They pour out of their homes, workshops and fields, their faces grim, their voices adding to the cacophony. You might have a head start of a few seconds, maybe a minute if you're lucky and the victim was slow to react. But that advantage is vanishing with every passing moment as dozens, perhaps hundreds, of feet begin to pound the muddy tracks behind you. The sound alone would be enough to make your blood run cold. It's not just a few people yelling. It's a wave of noise, a crescendo of outrage and alarm that alerts everyone in the vicinity, and even in neighbouring hamlets if the wind is right. This oral alarm system was remarkably effective in a world without telephones or police radios. Think of it as a medieval Amber Alert, but one that comes with an immediate angry mob. You can run, but you can't easily hide when the human equivalent of a pack of hounds is baying at your heels, their shouts flushing you out of any potential hiding spot. If you duck into an alley, someone will have seen you. If you try to lose yourself in a copse of trees, the sheer number of pursuers means they can spread out, effectively forming a human net. This isn't a disciplined, orderly chase by trained professionals. It's chaotic, messy, and driven by collective anger and a strong sense of communal justice. These are your neighbours, people who might have shared a drink with you yesterday, now transformed into a relentless, single-minded hunting party. And they know the terrain. They know every shortcut, every hiding place, every muddy patch you're likely to slip in. You, on the other hand, are probably panicking, your adrenaline-fueled flight making you clumsy and conspicuous. Your carefully planned escape route, if you even had one, now seems laughably inadequate against this tide of humanity. One of the mainstream historical facts here is the Statute of Winchester in 1285, which formally codified the system of hue and cry, along with other aspects of maintaining the king's peace, like the watch and ward. It legally mandated that all men keep arms in their homes appropriate to their status to be ready for such pursuits. So, some of these folks chasing you aren't just armed with righteous indignation. They might have actual weapons, staves, knives, perhaps even a rusty old spear. It suddenly makes tripping over your own feet seem like a particularly bad idea. Now, for a quirky tidbit. In some areas, the hue and cry was meant to be accompanied by the blowing of a horn. If the village possessed one, its blare would add another layer of urgency and reach to the alarm. Imagine, amidst the shouting, the mournful or frantic sound of a horn cutting through the air, a clear signal to anyone further afield that a pursuit was underway. It's almost comical to think of someone designated as the official hue and cry hornblower, but it underscores the seriousness with which this duty was taken. It also paints a rather vivid and slightly Monty Python-esque image of the chase. The effectiveness of the hue and cry lay in its immediacy and its collective nature. There was no waiting period, no need to file a report. The crime happens, the cry is raised, the chase is on. For you, the criminal, this means there's no breathing room, no chance to slip away unnoticed in the immediate aftermath of your act. The window of opportunity to simply vanish slams shut with the first shout. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for villagers joining the hue and cry was genuine moral outrage, fear of collective punishment, or simply the thrill of the chase and the chance to mete out some communal justice. Perhaps it was a potent cocktail of all three. Consider the psychological impact on you. You're not just being chased by an abstract concept of the law, you're being hunted by people you know, people whose trust you've, allegedly, betrayed. Their faces are contorted with anger, their shouts are personal. This isn't an impersonal state apparatus. This is your world turning against you in a very tangible and loud way. Your heart is hammering against your ribs, your lungs are burning, and every sound behind you is a reminder of your dwindling chances. You might try to double back to weave through the familiar lanes, but the village that was your home is now a labyrinth designed to trap you, its inhabitants the maze's shifting, angry walls. Even if you were a particularly swift runner, outpacing an entire village is a tall order. They can cut you off, anticipate your moves. If you make it to the edge of the village, the cry would be taken up by anyone working in the fields, or anyone on the road. The pursuit could, in theory, continue from village to village, the responsibility passing along like a rather grim relay race. Each new village would have to raise its own hue and cry, and continue the pursuit until the felon was caught or reached an area of sanctuary. It's a terrifying prospect, an ever-expanding circle of pursuers, all legally bound to hunt you down. Forget a discreet getaway. You've just triggered a human tidal wave. Your minor act of thievery, your moment of poor judgment, has escalated into a full-blown community-wide emergency, and you are public enemy number one, at least for the next few frantic, terrifying minutes. The village panopticon has become the village posse, and they are closing in. So the hue and cry is in full swing, a terrifying chorus of shouts and pounding feet nipping at your heels. Your lungs are screaming, your legs are burning, and the comforting anonymity you might have hoped for has evaporated like morning mist on a hot day. Your only thought is escape, putting as much distance as possible between yourself and that angry pitchfork-wielding mob. In your modern mind, this is where you'd be picturing a fast car, a stolen motorbike, or at the very least, a swift sprint to the nearest bus stop. But let's gently bring you back to the muddy reality of medieval England. Forget speedy getaways. Your options are depressingly and dangerously limited. Your primary mode of transport is, most likely, your own 2 feet. And while you might be a decent runner, remember, you're probably not wearing modern running shoes designed for optimal performance. You're likely shod in simple leather turn shoes, or perhaps even going barefoot if you're particularly poor. These aren't exactly built for speed or agility, especially on uneven, often muddy terrain. The roads, if you can even call them that, are a far cry from the smooth tarmac you're used to. Think rutted dirt tracks, often sucking at your footwear, strewn with loose stones, animal droppings, and various other delightful medieval obstacles. A twisted ankle isn't just painful, it's a full stop to your escape. Game over. Even if you are a naturally gifted athlete capable of outrunning the initial burst of village fury, what then? Where are you running to? The landscape isn't a convenient grid of streets leading to anonymous highways. It's a patchwork of fields, forests, and fens, crisscrossed by meandering paths that only locals truly know. You might think the woods offer cover, but they also slow you down and can be disorienting if you're not familiar with them. And remember, some of your pursuers are familiar with them. They know the game trails, the quickest ways through the undergrowth. Trying to lose them in the local woods might be like a mouse trying to outsmart a cat in its own house. What about a horse? Ah, the noble steed, the medieval equivalent of a sports car. Surely that's your ticket to freedom. Well, first you'd have to have a horse, which was a significant expense, putting it out of reach for many common folk. Owning a horse was a sign of status and wealth. If you're already resorting to petty theft, chances are a prize stallion isn't patiently waiting for you in a nearby stable. But let's say, for argument's sake, you managed to steal one. Riding a horse effectively, especially at speed and under pressure, isn't like hopping on a bicycle. It requires skill and experience. An inexperienced rider on a panicked horse is more likely to end up thrown into a ditch than galloping gracefully into the sunset. Plus, a stolen horse is a highly conspicuous item. It's like making your getaway in a bright pink Lamborghini. Memorable and easily traceable. Has anyone seen a nervous-looking fellow on a brown mare with a distinctive white blaze? That description will travel almost as fast as the hue and cry itself. Okay, so no horse. What about a cart? Perhaps you could commandeer an ox cart or a donkey cart. Now you're really talking slow. These vehicles were designed for hauling goods, not for high-speed chases. An ox lumbers along at a couple of miles per hour. Tops. You could probably walk faster. A donkey might be a tad quicker, but it's hardly going to outpace a determined group of people on foot, especially if they take shortcuts. And again, a stolen cart is noticeable. Its owner will want it back, and news of its theft will spread. You'd be a slow-moving target, easily overtaken. Trying to escape in an ox cart is the medieval equivalent of trying to outrun the police on a mobility scooter. Good luck with that. The infrastructure of the time simply didn't support rapid anonymous travel for the average person. There were no national rail networks, no intercity bus services, no conveniently placed airports. Rivers were major thoroughfares. Yes, but you'd need a boat. Stealing one presents its own challenges, and rowing or sailing effectively under duress is another skill set you probably don't possess. Plus, river traffic was also monitored. Someone would notice a strange boat being paddled frantically by a desperate-looking individual. One of the crucial historical facts here is the state of medieval roads. While the Romans had built impressive straight roads, many had fallen into disrepair by the medieval period. Responsibility for road maintenance was often local and haphazard. This meant that even main routes could be treacherous, boggy in winter and dusty in summer. Travel was slow and arduous, even for legitimate travellers. For a fugitive, these poor conditions were a significant impediment, not an aid. You can't exactly floor it when the road ahead looks more like a quagmire. For a quirky tidbit, consider the Law of the Verge. This was a mobile zone, notionally 12 miles in radius, that travelled with the king and his court. Within this zone, special royal jurisdiction applied, often meaning harsher penalties for crimes. If you were unlucky enough to commit your crime and attempt your escape near where the king was residing or travelling, you'd be in even hotter water. Imagine trying to make your getaway and inadvertently running straight into an area with beefed-up royal security and a monarch who really didn't like his peace being disturbed. Talk about bad timing. So your options are dwindling. You can't outrun the hue and cry indefinitely on foot. A horse is a risky, conspicuous long shot. A cart is laughably slow. The very landscape and infrastructure conspire against your rapid escape. This is a world built for a slower pace of life, where people generally didn't travel far from their homes unless they had a very good reason and the means to do so. A fleeing criminal, by definition, is out of place, an anomaly. Historians still argue whether the primary difficulty for a medieval fugitive was the initial escape from the immediate vicinity, or the long-term challenge of remaining anonymous and finding sustenance in a world where strangers were often viewed with suspicion. Both were, undoubtedly, immense hurdles. Even if you somehow managed to evade the initial hue and cry, perhaps by some miracle of luck or by diving into the foulest ditch in the county, you're then faced with the problem of survival as an unknown, unvouched for individual in a landscape where you don't belong. Where do you sleep? How do you get food? Every village you approach will eye you with caution. Who are you? Where are you from? Who can speak for you? These are questions you won't have good answers for. The idea of just melting into the crowd in the next town over doesn't quite work when towns themselves were often walled and had gatekeepers who might question newcomers. You're not just trying to escape the scene of the crime, you're trying to escape a society that is by its very nature resistant to unattached, unaccountable individuals. Your lack of a fast getaway car is compounded by the lack of anywhere to quickly and anonymously go. The slow, grinding pace of medieval life, which might seem charming from a distance, becomes a terrifying trap when you're on the wrong side of the law. Each muddy step you take is a laborious effort, and the shouts behind you, though perhaps fading slightly, are a constant reminder that time and road are not on your side. Let's say you've decided against the grim bargain of sanctuary and abjuration. Perhaps the thought of permanent exile wandering destitute in a foreign land was even more terrifying than facing the music back in your village. Or maybe you were just a bit too slow, and the hue and cry, that relentless wave of communal fury, caught up with you before you could even lay a desperate hand on the church door knocker. You're winded, surrounded, and the mood of the crowd is, shall we say, less than charitable. At this point, the raw, chaotic energy of the mob needs to be channeled, to be handed over, however reluctantly, to the first rung of the official legal ladder. And that first rung is often personified by a figure who is likely as unenthusiastic about this whole situation as you are, the village constable. Now, erase any image you might have of a smartly uniformed, professionally trained police officer. The medieval village constable was nothing of the sort. This wasn't a career choice. It was an unpaid, often unwelcome communal obligation, usually undertaken by a local man, a peasant, a craftsman, someone like your neighbours, for a set term, typically a year. He wasn't applying for the job because he had a passion for law enforcement and a desire to clean up the mean streets of Little Puddleton on the Marsh. He was likely appointed by the manor court or chosen by his fellow villagers, and refusing the office could lead to fines. So, your first official pursuer is, in essence, a reluctant amateur, probably wishing he were back tending his own fields or mending his own roof. His equipment? Don't expect a utility belt kitted out with tasers and pepper spray. He might have a staff or a cudgel, perhaps as much for his own protection as for subduing unruly suspects. He wouldn't have handcuffs. Rope would do the trick if you needed restraining. His office was likely his own cottage, and his police car was his own 2 feet, just like yours. His authority was derived from the community, and the expectation that he would, quite literally, keep the peace. This system, known as the watch and ward, relied on these local appointments to provide a rudimentary level of policing. So, the mob has you. They're jostling you, shouting accusations. The constable, let's call him Thomas, pushes his way through. He's probably a bit flustered. He's got an angry crowd on one side and a muddy, terrified suspect, that's you, on the other. His main job at this point is to prevent summary justice. That is to stop the villagers from simply beating you senseless or stringing you up from the nearest tree, which, depending on the crime and their temper, might be a very real possibility. He has to take you into custody, such as it is. This custody might involve him frog-marching you to his own house, or perhaps to a designated secure place in the village if one existed. Maybe a locked room in the church tower or a sturdy shed. There were no purpose-built police stations in every village. His responsibility was to hold you until you could be presented to a higher authority, usually the sheriff or a justice of the peace at the next local court session. This could be days or even weeks away. So you're stuck, under the watchful eye of a man who is probably sighing heavily and wondering why this had to happen on his watch. He's got his own work to do, after all. Guarding you is an unwelcome interruption to his daily life. One mainstream historical fact is that the office of constable, while often burdensome, was a crucial link in the chain of medieval law enforcement. These were the men on the ground, responsible for raising the hue and cry, if it hadn't already been raised, apprehending suspects, and keeping them secure until they could be passed up the judicial ladder. Without them, the entire system of local justice would have collapsed. They were, in many ways, the unwilling glue holding it all together. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some constables, to make their lives easier, or perhaps to supplement their non-existent income, might have engaged in some rather dubious practices. If a suspect seemed likely to cause trouble or attempt escape, the constable might employ rather uncomfortable, but effective methods of restraint. There are records of suspects being kept in stocks, if the village had them, or even more unpleasantly, being bound in awkward positions for extended periods. Forget your rights to comfortable detention. The primary concern was preventing your escape, and if that meant some discomfort for you, so be it. It's not exactly a 5-star holding cell experience. One account even describes a constable making a suspect wear a particularly heavy and awkward set of wooden spectacles to prevent them from running. The constable's role wasn't just about guarding you. He was also responsible for gathering basic information about the alleged crime. He'd listen to the accusers, perhaps take note of any obvious evidence, the stolen goods found in your possession, the blood on your tunic. Let's hope not. He was, in a very rudimentary way, the first investigator on the scene. However, his investigative skills were likely limited to common sense and local knowledge. Don't expect him to be dusting for fingerprints or analysing DNA. He's more likely to be asking, "All right, John, you say you saw him sneaking out of your coop with Henrietta the hen under his arm. Did anyone else see it?" Historians still argue whether the constable system was an effective deterrent to crime, or merely a reactive measure that often struggled to cope with determined offenders or organised criminal activity. For minor opportunistic local crimes, it probably worked reasonably well, largely because of the tight-knit nature of the community we've already discussed. But for more serious offences, or for criminals who were strangers to the area, the lone unpaid constable could be easily overwhelmed. So, there you are, apprehended. The adrenaline of the chase is wearing off, replaced by a cold, clammy fear and the dull ache of your exertions. You're probably filthy, possibly a bit bruised from the capture, and now you're under the guard of someone who is essentially your neighbour, deputised by duty. He's not necessarily your enemy, but he's not your friend either. He's just a cog in the machine of medieval justice, a machine that is slowly starting to grind, with you firmly caught in its gears. The villagers might still be milling about, casting angry or curious glances your way. The constable, Thomas, might offer you a sip of water, or he might just stare at you grimly, already composing the report he'll have to give to the reeve or the bailiff. Your immediate future is uncertain, but it almost certainly involves being held in less than ideal conditions, waiting for the next stage of a legal process that rarely favoured the accused. The clumsy calamity of your capture by the hue and cry has now transitioned into the slightly more formal, but no less precarious custody of the village constable. He's the gatekeeper to the next level of legal trouble, and he's probably just as eager to pass you on as you are to escape, though your reasons differ wildly. He wants to get back to his life. You want to, well, keep yours. You're brief and likely uncomfortable. Stay under the hospitality of the village constable, Thomas, eventually comes to an end. word of your alleged crime and capture has moved up the rudimentary chain of command. Perhaps the reeve of the manor has been informed, or a travelling bailiff has come through. The next step in your involuntary journey through the medieval legal system often involves an encounter with a figure of somewhat greater authority, though not necessarily greater competence or enthusiasm, the county sheriff and his posse. Now, if the term sheriff conjures images of a lone heroic lawman from a Wild West movie, diligently tracking down outlaws with steely determination, you'll need to adjust that picture considerably. The medieval sheriff, or shire reeve, was a royally appointed official, responsible for a whole county or shire. His duties were vast and varied, collecting taxes and royal revenues, overseeing royal estates, executing writs from the king's courts, impanelling juries, and yes, apprehending serious criminals and keeping them in the county jail. He was a powerful figure, often a knight or a man of significant local standing. However, law enforcement, in the modern sense, was only one part of a very broad job description, and arguably not always his top priority, especially if there were royal coffers to be filled. When a serious crime was committed, or if a fugitive like yourself needed to be apprehended, and the local hue and cry or constable had failed or needed backup, the sheriff had the authority to summon a posse comitatus. This lovely Latin phrase literally means the power of the county, and it empowered him to call upon all able-bodied men in the shire to assist him in pursuing and capturing felons. So, if you thought the village hue and cry was bad, imagine a potentially larger, more widely drawn group, theoretically under the command of a more powerful official. This was the medieval equivalent of a county-wide APB and manhunt. However, the reality of the sheriff's posse could often be quite different from the impressive theory. Firstly, summoning such a posse took time. Word had to go out, men had to gather. It wasn't an instant response team. Secondly, the enthusiasm and effectiveness of these conscripted deputies could vary wildly. Just like the village constable, these men were being taken away from their own work, their farms, their trades. While some might relish the excitement or the chance to uphold the king's peace, or perhaps just the chance to legally rough someone up, others would have seen it as an unwelcome burden. Arming themselves would also be their own responsibility. Again, think staves, farming implements, maybe an old bow if they were proficient. Don't picture a uniformly equipped SWAT team. It was more of a hastily assembled motley crew. If you've managed to evade capture for a while, perhaps slipping out of your village and becoming a wanderer, it might be the sheriff and his posse who are tasked with tracking you down, especially if your crime was considered serious enough to warrant this level of attention. Perhaps a robbery with violence, or if you were part of a gang. The sheriff would receive information about your whereabouts, maybe from informants, who are sometimes rewarded, or from other local officials who spotted a suspicious newcomer. He would then gather his posse and set off. Their methods of pursuit wouldn't be based on sophisticated forensics. It would be about local knowledge, tracking skills, if anyone in the posse possessed them, and asking questions. Have you seen a man of this description? He's wanted for stealing Lord Humphrey's prize pig and threatening his swineherd with a pointy stick. Information travelled slowly, but it did travel. And in a society where most people didn't venture far from their homes, a stranger was noticeable. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we might have joked about in another context? Well, your general appearance, your accent, your lack of local connections, these would all make you stand out more than any ineffective medieval cosmetic. One important historical fact is that the office of sheriff, while powerful, was also notoriously prone to corruption. Sheriffs were responsible for significant amounts of money, and the temptation to line their own pockets was ever present. Some sheriffs were seen as extortionate and abusive, using their power to enrich themselves rather than diligently uphold justice. The legendary Sheriff of Nottingham, antagonist to Robin Hood, is the archetypal example of a corrupt and overbearing sheriff, and while Robin Hood himself is a figure of folklore, the popular image of grasping sheriffs certainly had a basis in reality. This means that your encounter with the sheriff might not just be about justice, but about how much you, or your crime, might be worth to him, one way or another. Now, for a quirky tidbit. Sheriffs often had a distinct uniform or livery for themselves and their immediate household retinue, their permanent paid staff, not the temporarily summoned posse, to signify their authority. This might involve specific colours or badges. So, while the posse itself might look like a crowd of angry farmers, the sheriff and his core men might have a slightly more official, and therefore more intimidating, appearance. Seeing those colours approach would certainly signal a more serious level of trouble than just dealing with Constable Thomas. Historians still argue whether the posse comitatus was a genuinely effective tool for capturing elusive criminals, or more of a symbolic assertion of royal authority and the community's responsibility to police itself. In practice, its success probably depended heavily on the energy and dedication of the particular sheriff, the nature of the terrain, the cooperation of the local populace, and of course the skill and desperation of the fugitive. A well-organised gang of outlaws in a remote forest might prove very difficult for a hastily assembled posse to deal with. So, imagine you've been on the run. You're hungry, tired, constantly looking over your shoulder. Then, one day, you hear the distant sound of horns or shouts, different from the localised village hue and cry. You see a larger group of men, some perhaps mounted, purposefully moving across the landscape. This is the sheriff's posse. They're not as immediately frantic as the village mob, perhaps, but they represent a more organised, more official threat. Their net is wider, their authority greater. If you're caught by them, the experience is unlikely to be pleasant. They've been inconvenienced, possibly tramping through muddy fields for days to find you. Their patience might be thin. You'd be bound, probably roughly, and then escorted to the county jail, which was often located in the main town or castle of the shire. This journey itself could be arduous and humiliating. You're no longer just a local miscreant. You're now officially a county-level problem, a prisoner of the king's appointed representative. The shoddy posse, if it was indeed shoddy, might have been disorganised, but its sheer numbers and the authority behind it made it a formidable obstacle. You might outsmart one or two individuals, but outmanoeuvring a county-wide search led by a man with the king's authority is a different proposition. Your world, which had shrunk to the confines of your village under the constable, now expands to the terrifying prospect of the county jail and the justice that awaits you there. The slightly more organised, but still potentially haphazard, hunt has succeeded, and you are one step closer to a formal and likely very unpleasant reckoning. You've been apprehended perhaps by the clumsy but effective village constable, or maybe by the sheriff's somewhat more imposing, if still rather haphazard, posse. The immediate panicked flight is over, but your troubles are unfortunately just beginning. You're now enmeshed in the formal legal system, and medieval England had some rather unique methods for determining guilt or innocence, especially when concrete evidence was lacking. Forget DNA, fingerprints, or even reliable eyewitness testimony. For a significant period, and for certain types of accusation, you might find yourself facing God's painful judgment through a process known as the trial by ordeal. This wasn't a trial in the sense of lawyers presenting evidence and a jury deliberating. Oh no, this was a direct appeal to the Almighty, a belief that God would intervene to protect the innocent and reveal the guilty through a physical test. The premise was simple. If you were innocent, God would ensure you healed quickly, or were otherwise miraculously unharmed by the ordeal. If you were guilty, well, the unpleasant consequences of the ordeal would be compounded by divine displeasure, and your guilt would be manifest. It's a terrifying prospect, essentially outsourcing your fate to a combination of religious faith, extreme physical discomfort, and the rather subjective interpretation of the results. There were several popular forms of ordeal. One of the most common was the ordeal of hot iron. Here, you would be required to carry a piece of red-hot iron, usually weighing 1 to 3 pounds for a set distance, often 9 feet. Your hand would then be bound and bandaged, sealed by the priest who presided over the ceremony. Yes, these were ecclesiastical affairs held in or near a church. After 3 days, the bandages would be removed. If your hand was healing cleanly, without festering or infection, you were deemed innocent. God had protected you. If it was infected, blistered, and generally looking rather grim, well, that was God's way of saying guilty as charged. Given the general lack of understanding about hygiene and infection, in the medieval period, a clean healing would indeed seem miraculous. Just imagine the sheer terror of grasping that searing metal, the smell of your own flesh cooking. Another favourite was the ordeal of hot water. This involved you plunging your hand, sometimes up to the elbow, into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone or a ring. Again, your hand would be bound, and the 3-day waiting period for divine judgment on your healing progress would commence. The chances of avoiding a nasty scald were, to put it mildly, slim. It's like a particularly cruel party game, but with your life and reputation on the line. Then there was the ordeal of cold water. This one was often used for accusations of witchcraft, but also for other crimes. You would be bound thumb to opposite toe, a common method to prevent swimming, and then thrown into a body of consecrated water, a river or a pond blessed by a priest. If you sank, you were considered innocent, as the pure water had accepted you. You would then, hopefully, be pulled out before you drowned. If you floated, however, you were deemed guilty, as the holy water had rejected your corrupted soul. The grim irony, of course, is that floating is a natural human tendency, especially with trapped air in the lungs or clothing. So, innocence often meant nearly drowning, while guilt meant you simply didn't sink fast enough. It's a lose-lose situation worthy of a Kafka novel. This system of trial by ordeal is a well-documented historical fact. It was widely used in England and across Europe for centuries, particularly in cases where there was insufficient evidence for a more conventional trial, or when the accused was of a low status and couldn't find enough oath helpers to swear to their innocence, a process called compurgation, which was like having a crowd of character witnesses. The church played a central role in administering these ordeals, with priests conducting the rituals, blessing the instruments of the ordeal, the iron, the water, and interpreting the results. A quirky and rather grim tidbit is that there were specific prayers and liturgical formulas for each type of ordeal. These weren't just haphazard dunkings or burnings, they were solemn religious ceremonies. The accused would often fast and pray for a period before the ordeal, seeking divine favour. The priest would implore God to make a just judgment. This religious framing lent an aura of legitimacy and divine sanction to what was essentially a state-sanctioned physical trial. It's a chilling example of how deeply intertwined religious belief and judicial practice could be. The official end of trial by ordeal in England came in 1215, the same year as Magna Carta. The Fourth Lateran Council, a major church council convened by Pope Innocent III, forbade clergy from participating in ordeals. Without priestly involvement, the ordeals lost their religious legitimacy, and, consequently, their legal standing. The English Crown officially abolished them shortly thereafter. This decision forced the legal system to develop alternative methods of determining guilt, which, as we'll see, led to the increased prominence of the jury system. However, even though officially abolished in 1215, old habits died hard. Historians still argue about how quickly and completely trial by ordeal disappeared in practice, especially in more remote areas or in informal local justice. The underlying belief that God would intervene in human affairs to reveal truth was deeply ingrained, and some forms of popular justice or superstition might have continued to echo these older practices for some time. The idea of a trial being a physical test of endurance or divine favour lingered in the popular imagination. So imagine you are accused. There are no reliable witnesses. Maybe the evidence is circumstantial. You vehemently protest your innocence. Instead of a courtroom, you're led to the church. The priest is there, looking grave. The villagers are gathered, their faces a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity and judgment. The fire is lit. The iron glows a terrifying orange red, or the cauldron bubbles ominously. You're about to put your faith and your flesh quite literally to the test. The psychological pressure alone would be immense. Even if you were innocent, the fear of the pain, the fear of infection, the fear that God might, for some inscrutable reason, not intervene on your behalf, would be overwhelming. And if you failed the ordeal, the physical agony was just the precursor to the legal punishment for your crime, which would now be carried out with the full force of divine and secular condemnation. There was no appeal from God's judgment. Your festering hand or your buoyant body was irrefutable proof of your guilt. It's a system designed to extract a truth through means that had little to do with actual evidence or reasoned argument. Lucky for you, if your crime spree is taking place after 1215, you'll likely avoid this particular horror. But if you're an early medieval miscreant, this terrifying prospect is very much on the table. It makes the thought of facing a jury of your peers seem almost like a welcome relief, though that too will have its own medieval flavour. The terrifying prospect of trial by ordeal, that direct and painful appeal to divine judgment, thankfully began to fade from the official English legal landscape after 1215. The Fourth Lateran Council's prohibition on clerical involvement effectively pulled the rug out from under it, forcing the royal justice system to rely more heavily on a different method for determining guilt or innocence: trial by jury. Now when you hear trial by jury, you probably picture a solemn courtroom scene, with bewigged lawyers, a learned judge, and 12 impartial citizens carefully weighing evidence. While some elements are recognisable, the medieval jury was a rather different beast, and facing a jury of your neighbours could be just as nerve-wracking, albeit in a different way, as facing a red-hot iron. After being formally accused of a felony, a serious crime like homicide, arson or grand larceny, theft of goods worth more than a shilling, you would be brought before a royal court. This might be a local session of the General Eyre, where travelling royal justices visited counties to hear all pending cases, or a more regular local court. Here, your fate would be decided not by divine intervention, at least not directly, but by a group of 12 men, usually from the local area, the 100 or an even smaller locality, who were sworn to tell the truth. This was your jury of presentment, or accusing jury, which often also acted as the trial jury, or petty jury. These weren't necessarily peers in the modern sense of a cross-section of society. Jurors were typically men of some standing in the community, usually property owners. The idea was that they should be free and lawful men who were knowledgeable about local affairs and characters, and that's the crucial part. They weren't expected to be a blank slate, impartial, and knowing nothing of the case beforehand, as we expect today. Quite the opposite. Medieval jurors were often chosen precisely because they were likely to know something about the case, the victim, and importantly, about you, the accused. They were, in a sense, witnesses and deciders rolled into one. So instead of an impartial panel, you're facing 12 familiar faces. Maybe you owe one of them money. Maybe you had a boundary dispute with another last spring. Perhaps one of them is a good friend of the person you allegedly wronged. Or, conversely, maybe some of them like you, or dislike your accuser. These pre-existing relationships, grudges and alliances were an unavoidable part of the medieval trial. It's a far cry from the anonymous juries of today, who are often instructed to avoid any external information about the case. Your neighbours weren't just deciding your guilt based on evidence presented in court. They were drawing on their own knowledge, local gossip, and their personal assessment of your character. The trial itself would be a relatively swift affair. There were no prosecuting or defence lawyers in the modern sense for most of the medieval period, especially for common felonies. You, the accused, would be expected to speak for yourself, to answer the charges. The accuser would present their case. Witnesses might be called, but the rules of evidence were loose. The jurors would listen, and then they would deliberate, often right there in the courtroom or in a nearby room, and deliver their verdict, guilty or not guilty. One mainstream historical fact is that the development of the jury system was a cornerstone of English common law, and a significant step away from older, more arbitrary forms of justice like ordeal or trial by combat. Another charming medieval option, usually reserved for nobles, where guilt was determined by a duel. Magna Carta, in its famous Clause 39, stated that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions or outlawed or exiled or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. This judgment of his equals is widely seen as a key endorsement of the principle of trial by jury. Now for a quirky tidbit, sometimes, if a jury was struggling to reach a unanimous verdict, which was usually required, they could be forced. This meant that new jurors could be added to the panel until a sufficient majority or unanimity was achieved. Alternatively, and less pleasantly for the jurors, if they took too long to decide or were suspected of being difficult, they could be locked up without food or drink until they came to an agreement. This was a rather persuasive method of encouraging consensus. Imagine your local jury duty, but with the added pressure of starvation if you can't agree with Brenda from accounts about whether the defendant really stole those turnips. The power of these local jurors was immense. Their verdict could mean the difference between freedom and a very grim fate, as we'll explore later when we discuss medieval punishments. And their decisions were not always based purely on the facts of the specific crime. They might take into account your general reputation. Were you known as an honest, hard-working individual, or as a troublemaker and a layabout? This background information, often unspoken but universally understood within the small community, could heavily influence their judgment. Historians still argue whether medieval juries were more likely to deliver just verdicts based on evidence, or social verdicts, aimed at maintaining community cohesion, perhaps by acquitting a generally valued member of the community despite some evidence, or convicting an unpopular one on weaker grounds. This system also had its vulnerabilities. Intimidation of jurors was not unknown. A powerful local lord might subtly, or not so subtly, influence a jury to decide in a way that suited his interests. Bribery, though officially condemned, could also play a part. If you had wealthy friends or family, they might try to sway jurors with gifts or promises. Conversely, if your accuser was influential, the jury might be reluctant to find in your favour, regardless of the evidence. So, you're standing there, probably dishevelled and scared. 12 pairs of eyes are on you, eyes that have seen you grow up, or seen you at the market, or seen you drinking in the alehouse. They know your family, your friends, your enemies. Their deliberation is not an abstract legal exercise. It's a deeply personal judgment by the very people you live amongst. If they find you guilty, you won't just be a criminal in the eyes of the distant king. You'll be a convicted felon in the eyes of your own community. The shame and social ostracism, even if you avoided the harshest penalties, could be a life sentence in itself. The shift from ordeal to jury was a move towards a more rational system of justice, but it was still a system deeply embedded in the social fabric of the time. It wasn't an objective, clinical process. It was human, messy, and profoundly local. Your fate rested not on divine signs, but on the collective and potentially biased wisdom of your neighbours. And as you wait for those 12 men to pronounce your fate, you'd be acutely aware that their verdict would echo far beyond the courtroom, shaping how you were seen and how you survived in the small, interconnected world of medieval England. Whether you've been nabbed by the hue and cry, handed over by a weary constable, or perhaps even surrendered yourself hoping for mercy, and regardless of whether you're awaiting a trial by ordeal in the earlier medieval period, or a trial by a jury of your neighbours, there's a grim intermediary stage you'll likely have to endure. Pre-trial detention in a medieval jail, or jail. And if you're picturing a relatively regulated system with basic human rights, think again. Surviving a medieval jail until your trial date was a significant challenge in itself, a period fraught with danger, disease, and despair. First, let's talk about what these jails were actually like. They weren't the large, purpose-built penitentiaries you might imagine. For much of the medieval period, common jails were often located in the dungeons or gatehouses of castles, in fortified town towers, or sometimes even in specially designated but often inadequate buildings. These were not places designed for rehabilitation or even humane containment. Their primary purpose was to hold accused individuals securely until their trial, and to hold convicted criminals until their punishment could be carried out. Security, therefore, often trumped any concern for the well-being of the inmates. Imagine being thrust into a dark, damp, and incredibly crowded space. Light would be minimal, often filtering in through a small high window, or not at all in the deeper dungeons. The air would be thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, human waste. Sanitation was rudimentary at best, often consisting of a bucket in the corner or a latrine chute that was seldom cleaned. And disease. These were breeding grounds for illnesses like typhus, often called jail fever, dysentery, and various skin afflictions. Remember that lack of hygiene we touched upon earlier? It's about to get very personal and very unpleasant. Simply surviving the rampant disease was a lottery. You wouldn't be alone. Jails were typically crammed with all manner of individuals, men, women, and sometimes even children, all thrown in together regardless of the nature of their alleged crimes. You could be sharing your squalid patch of straw-covered floor with hardened ruffians, debtors, petty thieves, and those accused of serious felonies like yourself. Violence amongst prisoners was common, as stronger inmates preyed on the weaker for food, meagre possessions, or simply out of brutal boredom. There was no real segregation based on the severity of the crime or the vulnerability of the prisoner. It was a chaotic, brutal environment. One of the most crucial historical facts about medieval jails is that, for the most part, prisoners were expected to pay for their own upkeep. That's right, you had to pay for your imprisonment. The jailer, the man in charge of the prison, often ran it as a private enterprise. His income came not from a state salary, but from the fees he could extort from the prisoners and their families. This included charges for admission, known as javelin money or garnish, for food and drink, which was often meagre and overpriced, for bedding, if you wanted something better than the lice-infested straw on the floor, and even for the very chains that might be used to restrain you. If you had no money and no family outside to bring you provisions, you were in serious trouble. Starvation was a very real threat. This leads to a rather quirky and grim tidbit. Some jailers operated what were essentially different classes of accommodation within the prison. If you could afford it, you might be able to pay for a private cell, slightly better food, or even the privilege of having your chains loosened or removed. Poorer prisoners, however, were relegated to the worst conditions, often in communal dungeons known as the Pit or the Deep. The disparity was stark. It meant that your experience of imprisonment, and indeed your chances of surviving it, were heavily dependent on your wealth and social connections. It's a rather bleak form of pay-to-stay justice. The length of your stay could also be a major issue. You weren't necessarily tried quickly. Royal justices often travelled on circuits, visiting each county only once or twice a year for the jail delivery, the session where they cleared the jail by trying all the prisoners. This meant you could languish in these wretched conditions for months, sometimes even longer, before your case was heard. During this time, your health could deteriorate, your resources could be exhausted, and your spirit could be broken. Many died before ever facing a judge or jury. Historians still argue about the exact mortality rates in medieval jails, as record-keeping was inconsistent, but it's generally accepted that they were shockingly high. Disease, malnutrition, violence, and neglect all took their toll. For many, being sent to jail was practically a death sentence in itself, regardless of their eventual guilt or innocence. The phrase, "to rot in jail," was often a literal description of the fate awaiting many inmates. There was little in the way of oversight for these jailers. While there were occasional investigations into particularly egregious abuses, for the most part they operated with a great deal of autonomy. Their primary responsibility was to produce the prisoner for trial, not to ensure their welfare. If a prisoner died in their custody, it was often attributed to natural causes or illness, with few questions asked, so you're locked away. The heavy door has slammed shut, the bolts have been thrown. The darkness is punctuated by the moans of other prisoners, the scuttling of rats, and the constant gnawing hunger. The hope that sustained you during your flight or your initial capture begins to wane, replaced by a grim struggle for daily survival. You have to guard any meagre food you get, try to find a relatively safe place to sleep, and avoid antagonizing the more dangerous inmates or the jailer himself. The days blur into a monotonous cycle of fear and discomfort. This period of incarceration before trial was not considered part of the punishment. It was merely a holding measure. Yet for many it was a punishment in itself, and a severe one at that. It's a stark reminder that even before the formal judgment of the court, the medieval legal process could inflict immense suffering. Your ability to withstand these conditions, to stay alive and relatively healthy until your trial day, would be a testament to your resilience, your luck, or perhaps the kindness of a relative still able to slip you a bit of bread or a few coins through the jailer. The jail was a crucible, and many were consumed by its fires before ever seeing the inside of a courtroom. Let's assume you've somehow survived the horrors of the medieval jail. You haven't succumbed to jail fever, starvation, or the unwelcome attentions of your fellow inmates. Your trial day has finally arrived. Perhaps you faced a jury of your neighbours who, despite knowing about that unfortunate incident with the mayor's prize-winning petunia bed last summer, have listened to the evidence, or lack thereof, and delivered their verdict. Or perhaps your trial took place in an earlier era, and you miraculously passed an ordeal, your scalded hand healing with suspicious cleanliness. Whatever the process, the outcome is now key. If you're found not guilty, you're free to go, albeit probably scarred by the experience and poorer from jail fees. But if you're found guilty, you face punishment. And in medieval England, punishment was a very public, very physical, and often very brutal affair. However, not all guilty verdicts led directly to the gallows. For many crimes, especially those that weren't capital offences, you might find yourself on the receiving end of what was considered a merciful sentence. Mutilation. Yes, you heard that right. The deliberate judicial maiming of your body, the loss of a hand, a foot, an eye, or perhaps your ears or nose, was a common form of punishment. It sounds barbaric to our modern sensibilities, and it undoubtedly was, but from the medieval perspective it served several purposes. Firstly, it was a permanent, visible mark of your criminality. Everyone who saw you would know you were a convicted felon. Your missing hand would be a constant reminder of your past deeds. a walking advertisement for the consequences of breaking the law. This served as a powerful deterrent to others and made it harder for you to reoffend, or at least to do so anonymously. If you're known as One-Eyed Jack the Sheep Stealer, your reputation precedes you. Secondly, it was seen as a step down from the death penalty. In a legal system where a surprisingly large number of offences were technically capital crimes, meaning punishable by death, mutilation was often presented as a form of royal mercy or judicial leniency. You stole a loaf of bread, which could get you hanged, but because the judge is feeling generous today, we'll just take your right hand. It's a rather grim form of clemency, but in the context of the times, it might have been seen as a lucky escape. You get to live, albeit disfigured and likely disabled. The specific type of mutilation often corresponded, sometimes symbolically, to the crime. For instance, a thief might lose a hand, the instrument of their theft. Someone convicted of perjury, lying under oath, might have their tongue pierced or cut. Those caught poaching royal game in the king's forest, a very serious offence, as it infringed on the king's exclusive hunting rights, might be blinded or have their fingers lopped off to prevent them from drawing a bow again. It's a brutal calculus, fitting the punishment quite literally to the crime. This practice of judicial mutilation is a well-established historical fact, with laws from the Anglo-Saxon period onwards prescribing specific maimings for specific offences. The Assize of Clarendon in 1166, for example, decreed that those found guilty of robbery or murder who had a bad reputation should lose a foot. Even after the Norman conquest, these traditions continued and were incorporated into common law. It wasn't just a haphazard act of vengeance, it was a codified, legally sanctioned punishment. Now, for a quirky or perhaps stomach-turning tidbit, the actual act of mutilation was usually carried out publicly by an executioner or a designated official. There was no anaesthetic, obviously. The instruments used would be crude, an axe for a hand or foot, a knife or shears for ears or noses, perhaps a heated poker for blinding. The process would be agonizingly painful and carried a high risk of infection, which could easily lead to death even if the mutilation itself wasn't intended to be fatal. So, this mercy was still a life-threatening ordeal. There are even accounts of people being required to carry their own severed limb away from the place of punishment. Imagine that walk of shame. The aim wasn't just to punish, but to make a spectacle. These punishments were often carried out in the marketplace or another public square, ensuring a large audience. The sight of someone being publicly maimed, their screams, the blood, it was all part of the deterrent effect. It was a visceral lesson to anyone contemplating a life of crime. This could be you. It's a far cry from the relatively private and clinical nature of modern justice. Historians still argue about the true leniency of mutilation. While it spared the condemned's life, it often rendered them incapable of earning a living, especially if they were a manual labourer. Losing a hand would make farming, smithing, or most crafts incredibly difficult, if not impossible. This could drive the maimed individual into deeper poverty and desperation, potentially leading them to reoffend out of sheer necessity, despite their visible brand. Was it truly mercy, or just a slower, more agonizing form of social and economic death? Think about the psychological impact. You survive your crime, your trial, your imprisonment. You're brought out blinking into the daylight, not to freedom, but to a platform where a grim-faced man with an axe is waiting. The crowd watches, a mixture of horror, pity, and morbid fascination on their faces. The pain is unimaginable, a searing agony that rips through you, and then you are released back into society, permanently marked, permanently disabled. How do you rebuild a life after that? How do you cope with the constant stares, the whispers, the physical limitations? This wasn't just for minor offences either. While capital crimes often led to execution, maiming could be applied for a range of felonies. Counterfeiting coins, for example, was a very serious offence against the crown and could result in the loss of a hand. Repeated petty theft, assault, or even certain forms of public disorder could also lead to such punishments. It was a versatile tool in the medieval judicial arsenal. So when you contemplate your potential fate as a convicted criminal in medieval England, remember that the options weren't simply jail or gallows. There was this significant, brutal middle ground of judicial mutilation. It was a world where justice was written on the body, where your past sins were literally carved into your flesh for all to see. It makes that stolen chicken or those liberated tools seem like a very, very bad bargain indeed. The so-called mercy of the court could leave you wishing they'd just taken your life instead. Perhaps your crime was deemed too severe for the mercy of mutilation. Maybe you were convicted of homicide, treason, arson, or you were a repeat offender whose luck had finally run out. In such cases, the medieval justice system had a more final solution: execution. And this wasn't a quiet clinical procedure hidden away from public view. Your death was destined to become a form of macabre public entertainment, a gruesome spectacle designed to instill fear and reinforce the authority of the law. The methods of execution varied, often depending on the nature of the crime and the social status of the condemned. The most common form of capital punishment for ordinary felons was hanging. You would be taken from the jail, often in a cart, on a procession through the town to the gallows, which were usually situated in a prominent public place, perhaps at a major crossroads, on a hill overlooking the town, or just outside the town gates. This journey itself was part of the ritual, a last chance for the public to revile or, occasionally, pity the condemned. Sometimes, the prisoner was allowed a final drink at a designated pub along the route, a small, strange mercy before the inevitable. The hanging itself was often a brutal and inefficient affair. Forget the long drop method designed for a quick neck-snapping death. In medieval times, it was typically a short drop hanging, meaning the condemned was simply turned off a ladder or hoisted from a cart. This often resulted in a slow, agonizing death by strangulation, sometimes lasting for several minutes. The victim would struggle, convulse, and slowly asphyxiate, all in full view of the assembled crowd. It was, by all accounts, a horrifying sight. This public nature of execution is a key historical fact. These events were well attended, drawing crowds from the town and surrounding countryside. Men, women, and children would gather to watch. For many, it was a grim form of entertainment, a break from the monotony of daily life. For others, it was a moral lesson, a stark reminder of the consequences of sin and crime. The authorities certainly intended it as such. The sight of a body dangling from the gallows served as a constant silent warning. Sometimes the bodies were left hanging for extended periods, decaying in public view, to maximize this deterrent effect. Imagine walking past that on your way to the market every day. Now for a quirky, or rather ghastly tidbit. After an execution, particularly if the criminal was notorious, there was sometimes a rush for relics from the body or the gallows. A piece of the rope used for the hanging, a chip of wood from the gallows, or even a touch from the condemned's hand, especially if they were believed to have healing powers, a strange folk belief associated with some executed criminals, might be sought after for supposed magical or medicinal properties. It's a bizarre intersection of justice, superstition, and the macabre. The executioner himself might also profit by selling the condemned's clothes or other meagre possessions. The types of execution could be even more horrific for certain crimes. Treason, considered the most heinous offence as it was a direct attack on the king and the social order, was often punished by being hanged, drawn, and quartered. This was a particularly gruesome and prolonged ritual. The condemned would be dragged, drawn, on a hurdle to the place of execution, hanged until almost dead, then disemboweled while still alive, their entrails often burned before their eyes. Finally, their body would be quartered, chopped into 4 pieces, and the head severed. These dismembered parts would then be displayed in prominent public places across the kingdom. London Bridge was a favourite spot for heads, as a terrifying warning against rebellion. It was a punishment designed to inflict maximum pain, degradation, and symbolic destruction. Women convicted of treason or certain other serious crimes, such as murdering their husbands, known as petty treason, were typically sentenced to be burned at the stake. This was considered a more decent execution for women than drawing and quartering, though no less agonizing. Death by burning was slow and incredibly painful. Again, these were public events, meant to shock and awe the populace. Historians still argue about the true effectiveness of these brutal public executions as a deterrent. While they undoubtedly instilled fear, the sheer number of executions for a wide range of offences suggests that they didn't entirely stamp out crime. Some scholars suggest that the very frequency and brutality of these spectacles might have to some extent desensitized the population to violence, or even turned some criminals into folk heroes in the eyes of the disaffected. Did seeing constant death make people more law-abiding, or just more hardened? Imagine yourself in that cart rattling over the cobblestones. The crowd is jeering, perhaps some are praying. The priest might be walking alongside, urging you to confess your sins and make peace with God. You see the gallows looming ahead, a stark, ugly silhouette against the sky. The fear would be overwhelming. This isn't a quiet, dignified end. It's a public degradation, a final, terrifying performance in which you are the unwilling star. The executioner, often a figure both feared and reviled, would prepare the noose. There would be a final moment, perhaps a chance for a last statement, though this wasn't always granted or audible over the noise of the crowd. Then, the ladder would be kicked away, or the cart pulled from under you. The world would tilt, the rope would bite into your neck, and your desperate struggle for air would begin, all for the edification and warning of the assembled onlookers. This was the ultimate price for failing to navigate the treacherous paths of medieval law. If you couldn't convince your neighbours of your innocence, if you couldn't afford to bribe your way out, if you weren't lucky enough to get away with just losing a hand or an eye, this was your fate. The spectacle of your death was intended as the final, unanswerable statement of the law's power. Your life, extinguished in public, became a grim lesson woven into the fabric of medieval society. Sweet dreams were probably not on the agenda for anyone who witnessed such an event, let alone experienced it. Let's say you've managed to avoid immediate capture. The hue and cry faded behind you. You didn't seek sanctuary, and the constable hasn't clapped you in irons yet. You might think you're home free, a clever rogue who has slipped through the cracks of medieval justice. But there's another, more insidious status that could befall you, especially if you failed to appear in court when summoned after being accused of a serious felony. You could be declared an outlaw, and becoming an outlaw in medieval England wasn't a romantic adventure like Robin Hood's. It was a terrifying legal and social death sentence, transforming you into what was known as a wolf's head. The term wolf's head, caput lupinum jure, he shall bear a wolf's head, was deeply symbolic. It meant that you were considered no different from a wild, ravenous wolf, a dangerous beast to be hunted down and killed by anyone, without any legal repercussions for the killer. You were stripped of all legal protection, all rights, all standing in society. Your property could be forfeit to the crown or your lord. You ceased to be a person in the eyes of the law, and became, quite literally, fair game. It's a chilling concept, your life having no more value than that of a predatory animal. The process of outlawry usually began when you were accused of a felony, and failed to attend a series of summonses to the county court. After a set number of no-shows, often 5, the court would formally declare you an outlaw. This declaration would be proclaimed publicly, so everyone in the Shire and potentially beyond would know your status. From that moment on, your existence became incredibly precarious. You couldn't live openly in any community. To shelter an outlaw was a serious crime in itself, so even friends or family would be risking their own safety and property by helping you. You would be forced to live on the fringes of society, perhaps in forests, marshes, or remote unpopulated areas, the traditional haunts of outlaws in folklore. But this wasn't a life of merry men in green tights. It was a desperate, lonely struggle for survival. How would you get food? Stealing it would only confirm your criminality and make you more actively hunted. Begging would be risky, as your status as an outlaw would likely be known or suspected. This concept of outlawry is a core historical fact of medieval English law, with roots deep in Germanic legal traditions. It was a powerful tool for dealing with fugitives and those who defied the king's justice. It effectively turned the entire population into potential enforcers of the law against the outlawed individual. There was often even a bounty offered for the head of an outlaw, further incentivizing people to hunt you down. Remember the sheriff's posse we talked about? They'd be particularly keen to find an outlaw. Now for a quirky, or rather grimly illustrative tidbit. The legal phrase wolf's head wasn't just a metaphor. In some early Germanic laws, from which English common law drew some inspiration, there were rituals where an outlaw was symbolically driven out and declared to be wolfish. The idea was that they had broken the bonds of kinship and community so profoundly that they were no longer considered human in the same way. While the rituals might have become less literal by the high medieval period in England, the legal and social consequences were just as severe. Your very humanity was in a sense revoked. The life of an outlaw was one of constant fear and hardship. You'd be exposed to the elements, reliant on your wits and often on further crime to survive. You couldn't trust anyone. Any stranger you met could be someone looking to claim the price on your head. Even fellow outlaws might betray you for their own gain or to try and win a pardon. It was a life of perpetual vigilance, hunger, and isolation. The romantic image of the noble outlaw, robbing from the rich to give to the poor, is largely a later embellishment. Most outlaws were likely desperate individuals trying to scrape by in an incredibly hostile world. Historians still argue about how many people actually lived for extended periods as outlaws. While the legal status was clear, successfully evading capture indefinitely in a relatively small and interconnected country like medieval England would have been exceptionally difficult. Some outlaws might have joined existing criminal gangs for mutual protection, operating in remote areas and preying on travellers. Others might have tried to flee the kingdom entirely, becoming exiles in a different sense than those who abjured the realm through sanctuary. For many, outlawry was likely a prelude to eventual capture or death, either at the hands of pursuers or through starvation, disease, or exposure. Imagine the psychological toll. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every distant shout, every unfamiliar face would send a jolt of fear through you. You'd be cut off from all normal human contact, unable to seek comfort or aid. The greenwood, which might seem like a refuge, would become your prison. Your only companions would be hunger, cold, and the constant dread of discovery. The freedom of the outlaw was the freedom of the hunted animal, always one step away from the trap or the hunter's arrow, and if you were caught, there was no trial. Your outlaw status was, in itself, a death sentence. You could be killed on sight, or if taken alive, you would likely be brought before a court merely to confirm your identity as the proclaimed outlaw before being summarily executed. There was no defence, no appeal. Your time for legal process had long passed. So while you might have initially congratulated yourself on escaping the immediate clutches of the law, the declaration of outlawry hangs over you like a perpetually darkening cloud. It's a slow-acting poison, gradually isolating you, stripping away your hope, and turning every man's hand against you. It's a stark illustration of how medieval society dealt with those who utterly rejected its authority. You weren't just outside the law, you were beneath it, a subhuman entity to be eradicated. The lonely end of the outlaw was often a forgotten death in a ditch, or a forest clearing, or a swift, brutal end on the gallows if they were unlucky enough to be recognised. It's a far cry from a merry life in Sherwood Forest. Let's rewind a bit. You've committed your crime, perhaps that ill-advised pilfering of goods, or a more serious transgression. The hue and cry has been raised, or maybe you're already in the less than tender care of the constable. Now, in our modern world, this is where the forensic teams would swoop in, dusting for fingerprints, collecting DNA samples, analysing ballistics, or checking CCTV footage. But in medieval England, forget it. The concept of crime scene investigation as we know it was utterly non-existent. The methods for gathering evidence and identifying culprits were rudimentary, relying heavily on eyewitness accounts, confessions, often extracted under dubious circumstances, as we'll see later, and very basic, often flawed forms of material evidence. When a crime was discovered, the first investigators were usually the victim themselves, their family, or their neighbours. They would survey the scene, look for obvious clues, and most importantly try to think who might have had the motive and opportunity. Remember the village panopticon. That intense local knowledge was the primary investigative tool. Old man Hemlock's prize pig is gone. Who was seen loitering near his sty yesterday? Young Watt has been looking shifty and suddenly has money for ale. This kind of local deduction, based on familiarity and suspicion, was often the starting point. Eyewitness testimony was king, but it was also notoriously unreliable, just as it can be today, but with fewer checks and balances. If someone claimed they saw you committing the crime, that was powerful evidence, especially if the witness was considered credible, i.e., a man of good standing, not a known liar or someone with a grudge against you, though proving that grudge could be difficult. However, in the dim lighting of medieval homes, or in the confusion of a nighttime theft, or with the fallibility of human memory, mistakes were easily made. Someone might genuinely believe they saw you, even if it was someone else of similar build or wearing similar clothes. There were no lineups under controlled conditions. Material evidence was sometimes considered, but its interpretation was often simplistic. If stolen goods were found in your possession, or hidden in your cottage, that was pretty damning. This is the origin of the legal principle that possession of recently stolen goods is strong evidence of theft, a concept that still exists in law today. But what if the goods were planted there? What if you bought them innocently from someone else, unaware they were stolen? Proving your innocence in such circumstances, with no receipts and a legal system that often presumed guilt if things looked bad, was an uphill battle. One key historical fact is the role of the coroner in investigating suspicious deaths. The office of coroner, from custos placitorum coronae, or keeper of the king's pleas, was established in the late 12th century. Coroners were local officials, often knights, responsible for investigating cases of sudden or unexplained death to determine if a felony had occurred and to safeguard the Crown's financial interests, as the property of convicted felons could be forfeit. They would convene a local jury to view the body, examine the scene, and hear testimony. This was perhaps the closest thing to a formal forensic investigation at the time, but it was still very basic. They would note the position of the body, any visible wounds, and any weapons found nearby. However, their understanding of pathology or cause of death was limited by the medical knowledge of the era. A wound might be obvious, but distinguishing between an accident, suicide, or murder could be very challenging if there were no witnesses. For a quirky and rather unscientific tidbit from folklore and some historical accounts, consider the cruentation, or beer rite. This was the belief that the body of a murder victim would spontaneously bleed in the presence of their murderer. Sometimes, accused individuals would be forced to approach or touch the corpse. If the wounds were seen to bleed afresh, it was taken as a divine sign of their guilt. Needless to say, this test had no scientific basis whatsoever. Post-mortem bleeding can occur for various reasons, but it shows the kind of superstitious or faith-based evidence that could sometimes influence perceptions, even if it wasn't always formally admissible in court. It highlights the gap between their understanding of physical evidence and ours. Tracking offenders, if they had fled, relied on basic methods. Footprints might be followed if the ground was soft, but this was an imprecise art. Information from informants, as we discussed with the sheriff's posse, was crucial. Descriptions of the culprit would be circulated, but these would be based on memory and often vague. A tall man with a dark beard wearing a brown tunic. In a world where many people dressed similarly, and personal identification like photo IDs didn't exist, this made finding a specific individual challenging unless they had very distinctive features or were already known in the area. Historians still argue about the degree to which medieval justice was truly blind. While the legal system had its procedures, the lack of sophisticated investigative techniques meant that outcomes could be heavily influenced by social status, reputation, local prejudices, and the ability of the accuser or accused to make a convincing case, or to find convincing oath helpers in earlier systems. An eloquent accuser or a defendant who broke down under questioning might sway a jury more than any piece of ambiguous physical evidence. So, if you're banking on the authorities being unable to find any forensic evidence linking you to the crime, you're right. They wouldn't find fingerprints or DNA, but they wouldn't need to. A suspicious neighbour, a shifty look reported by the alewife, or the unfortunate discovery of that liberated chicken pot in your hovel could be more than enough to bring you before the courts. The CSI medieval village team consisted of gossip, assumption, and the occasional bit of common-sense deduction, often with a healthy dose of bias mixed in. There were no crime labs, no forensic pathologists meticulously examining fibres. The investigation was as rough and ready as many other aspects of medieval life. The focus was often on finding a culprit, and if you happened to fit the bill, or if someone had a reason to point the finger your way, the lack of contradictory scientific evidence wouldn't necessarily save you. You're operating in a system where accusation itself carries immense weight, and the burden of proving innocence, despite legal theories to the contrary, often fell heavily on your shoulders. Your best hope wasn't for the investigators to miss a crucial clue, but for no one to have seen you, or for your neighbours to actually like you enough to doubt your guilt. You find yourself in a truly desperate situation. Perhaps the evidence against you, however circumstantial, seems overwhelming. Maybe the jury of your neighbours is looking particularly grim-faced, or you're facing a judge known for his severity. The prospect of mutilation, or the hangman's noose, looms large. Is there any last-ditch improbable escape route from the jaws of medieval justice? Well, for a select few, there was a peculiar and rather clever loophole known, has benefit of clergy, which sometimes involved proving your clerical status, or more loosely your literacy, by reading a short passage from the Bible, famously dubbed the neck verse. Originally, benefit of clergy was a privilege asserted by the Church, claiming that clergymen, those in holy orders, priests, deacons, monks, etc., accused of crimes should be tried in ecclesiastical courts, church courts, rather than secular royal courts. Church courts were generally more lenient than their royal counterparts, particularly regarding capital punishment. They couldn't sentence someone to death. Punishments in church courts often involved penance, degradation, being stripped of clerical status, or imprisonment in a bishop's prison, which, while still unpleasant, was usually preferable to being hanged or mutilated by the king's justice. Over time, this privilege began to be extended, sometimes quite generously, beyond just ordained clergymen. The key test often became one of literacy. If an accused man could demonstrate an ability to read, it was sometimes taken as evidence that he was, or could be considered for legal purposes, a clerk, and thus eligible for benefit of clergy. And the standard test for this literacy, reading a specific verse from the Bible, usually Psalm 51 verse 1, Miserere me Deus, secundum magnum misericordiam tuum. Have mercy on me, O God, according to thy great mercy. This became known as the neck verse, because successfully reading it could, quite literally, save your neck from the hangman's noose. So imagine the scene. You're convicted, or about to be. Your heart is pounding. The judge asks if you can claim benefit of clergy. A Bible or a psalter is produced, open to the crucial verse. All eyes are on you. Can you read it? If you could stumble your way through those Latin words, even if you didn't fully understand them, the secular court might grant your claim. You wouldn't be acquitted, but your case would be transferred to the church authorities. You'd likely still face punishment, but it would generally be less severe and, crucially, non-capital. This practice of benefit of clergy and the neck verse is a well-documented historical fact, and persisted in English law, in various forms, for centuries, well beyond the medieval period, only being fully abolished in the 19th century. It created a significant disparity in the application of justice, as those who were literate, a small minority of the population, especially in earlier medieval times, had a potential escape route from the harshest penalties that was unavailable to the illiterate masses. Now, for the quirky tidbit, because Psalm 51:1 was so consistently used, it became known as the neck verse. Savvy criminals, or those with aspirations to a life of crime who possessed a modicum of foresight, might actually try to memorize this single verse, even if they couldn't read anything else. If they could recite this one line from memory when presented with the text, they might be able to fool the court into believing they were literate enough to qualify. It's like a cheat code for the medieval justice system. Of course, a suspicious judge might then ask them to read a different passage, so it wasn't a foolproof plan, but the very existence of this one verse to save them all is a fascinating quirk of legal history. Some jailers were even rumoured to unofficially teach the neck verse to prisoners for a fee, offering a sliver of hope. The application of benefit of clergy was not always straightforward. Initially, it was primarily for men. Women were generally excluded, though this began to change in later periods. There were also debates about how clerical one needed to be. Did simply being able to read make you a clerk? What about tonsured clerks? Those who had taken the first step into clerical orders by having their hair cut in a particular way but weren't fully ordained. The rules could be complex and subject to interpretation. Historians still argue about the true impact and intent of benefit of clergy. Was it a genuine attempt by the Church to assert its moral authority and offer mercy? Or was it a legal fiction that disproportionately benefited a slightly more educated class of criminal, allowing them to escape the full rigour of the law that fell upon the uneducated peasantry? It certainly highlighted the power of literacy in a largely illiterate society, and demonstrated the ongoing jurisdictional tensions between the Church and the Crown. For you, the accused, if you happened to be one of the fortunate few who could read, this offered a desperate lifeline. As the book is placed before you, the Latin words swimming before your terrified eyes, your ability to decipher that short sentence becomes the most important skill you possess. The hushed courtroom waits. Your sweaty finger traces the line. Miserere me, Deus. If you can get the words out, a wave of relief might wash over you, quickly followed by the uncertainty of what the ecclesiastical court has in store. It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card, but it's a get-out-of-being-hanged-free card, which is a significant improvement. However, if you're like the vast majority of the medieval population, unable to read Latin, or any language for that matter, this loophole is firmly closed to you. The neck verse remains just a jumble of meaningless symbols on a page, and the hangman remains a very real and imminent prospect. It's another example of how justice in medieval England was far from uniform, with factors like your education, your social connections, or even your gender playing a significant role in the outcome of your unfortunate brush with the law. The clergy's clever clause was clever indeed, but only for a chosen few. Throughout our grim journey as a hypothetical medieval criminal, we've largely assumed a male protagonist. But what if you, our unfortunate lawbreaker, were a woman? The experience of crime and punishment in medieval England was significantly shaped by gender. While women were, statistically, less likely to be accused of the most violent felonies like homicide or armed robbery compared to men, they were certainly not absent from the criminal landscape, and when they did fall foul of the law, they faced a justice system that viewed them through a specific, often biased, gendered lens, leading to particular types of accusations and sometimes uniquely brutal penalties. Firstly, the types of crimes women were most commonly accused of often reflected their social roles and perceived natures. Petty theft, especially of food or household goods, was common, perhaps reflecting economic hardship and a responsibility for feeding a family. Think of a desperate mother stealing a loaf of bread or some cloth from the market. Women were also frequently accused of being common scolds, that is, women who habitually argued, gossiped maliciously, or disturbed the peace with their tongues. While this might seem minor to us, it was taken seriously as a disruption of social order and could lead to public humiliation, such as being paraded through the streets or subjected to the cucking stool or ducking stool, a chair in which the offender was tied and then plunged into a river or pond, a punishment both humiliating and dangerous. Remember the village panopticon and the importance of communal harmony? The scolding woman was seen as a threat to that. Infanticide and concealment of birth were also crimes almost exclusively associated with women, particularly unmarried women who became pregnant and sought to hide the shame or the economic burden of an illegitimate child. These were treated with extreme severity, often resulting in a death sentence if proven. The burden of proof could be difficult, but societal condemnation was immense. One major area where women faced unique and devastating accusations was witchcraft. While witch crazes peaked a bit later, in the early modern period, accusations of witchcraft and harmful magic, maleficium, certainly occurred in medieval England. Women, particularly old, poor or socially isolated women, were disproportionately targeted. If a cow suddenly fell ill, a child developed a strange sickness, or a storm ruined the crops, it was sometimes easier to blame a local wise woman or a disliked neighbour for casting a spell than to accept misfortune. As we'll explore more in the next section, these accusations were terrifyingly hard to disprove. A crucial historical fact is that women, for much of the medieval period, had a different legal standing than men. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was largely subsumed by that of her husband. He was legally responsible for her actions in many, though not all, circumstances. This could sometimes work in her favour, with the husband being fined or punished for her lesser misdeeds. However, it also meant she had fewer independent legal rights. She couldn't typically make contracts, own property independently in the same way a man could, or sue in court without her husband. If she committed a serious crime on her own, however, she faced the law directly. Now for a quirky, or rather tragic legal provision specifically for women, the pleading the belly or benefit of belly. If a woman was convicted of a capital crime and sentenced to death, she could claim she was pregnant. If a jury of matrons, a group of experienced local women, examined her and confirmed the pregnancy, her execution would be stayed, usually until after the child was born. The rationale was that the innocent child should not be punished for the mother's crime. This wasn't a pardon. The execution was merely postponed. However, it did offer a temporary reprieve, and sometimes, in the intervening months, a pardon might be secured. Through other means or circumstances might change. It was a desperate plea, and the examination by the jury of matrons was no doubt a stressful and invasive experience. As we touched upon earlier with execution methods, women faced different forms of capital punishment. For treason, including petty treason, such as a wife killing her husband, seen as a disruption of the domestic hierarchy analogous to betraying the king, the punishment for women was typically burning at the stake, whereas men were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Why the difference? Historians still argue about the precise reasons, but theories include notions of public decency. Burning was considered less exposing than the dismemberment involved in hanging, drawing, and quartering for men, though that seems a rather thin veil of propriety over such a brutal act, or symbolic associations of fire with purification. Whatever the reason, it was an agonizing death. For other capital offences, women were usually hanged, just like men. However, there were social anxieties around the public execution of women, and sometimes their bodies were treated differently post-mortem. The concern for modesty, even in death, could be a factor, though this didn't prevent the execution itself. Consider also the vulnerability of women within the justice system. Without legal representation, facing an all-male judiciary and often all-male juries, except for the jury of matrons, a woman accused of a crime might find it harder to make her voice heard or to be perceived as credible, especially if she didn't conform to societal expectations of demure, submissive femininity. A woman who spoke forcefully in her own defence might be seen as shrewish or defiant, further damning her in the eyes of the court. Benefit of clergy, that literacy loophole we discussed, was also generally not available to women for much of the medieval period. The very term clerk implied a male status, so one of the primary escape routes from capital punishment for literate men was closed to their female counterparts, regardless of their ability to read the neck verse. This disparity only began to be seriously addressed much later, so if you were a woman navigating the medieval criminal justice system, your gender was an inescapable factor. It shaped the crimes you were likely to be accused of, the way you were perceived by the courts, the specific legal pleas available or unavailable to you, and even the manner of your potential execution. The system was not gender-blind. It was built upon and reinforced the patriarchal structures of medieval society. Your chances of lasting a day as a criminal were already slim, but as a female criminal, you faced a unique set of challenges and prejudices that made the path even more perilous. We've touched on how accusations of witchcraft could be particularly perilous for women, but the shadow of superstition and the fear of the demonic loomed large over everyone in medieval England, and it could easily turn a minor accusation, or even just general unpopularity, into a life-threatening ordeal. If you managed to acquire a reputation for being unlucky, or for having an uncanny knack for things going wrong around you, or if you simply engaged in practices that were outside the accepted Christian norms, you could find yourself facing charges far more terrifying and difficult to refute than simple theft. Accusations of witchcraft, sorcery, or consorting with demons. Medieval society was deeply religious, but it was also steeped in folk beliefs, superstitions, and a genuine fear of the supernatural. The lines between folk magic, perhaps using herbs for healing, or charms for good luck, outright sorcery intended to harm, maleficium, and demonic pacts were often blurred in the popular imagination, and certainly in the eyes of accusers. While the great witch hunts that swept through Europe were more a feature of the early modern period, roughly 16th to 18th centuries, the medieval period laid much of the groundwork. Accusations did happen, and they could be devastating. Imagine you're a village herbalist. You have knowledge of plants and their properties, and you help people with minor ailments. For years you're respected, but then a few of your patients don't recover, or even die, which given the state of medieval medicine was hardly uncommon. Or perhaps a rival healer, or someone with a grudge, starts whispering that your remedies are a bit too effective, or that you seem to know things you shouldn't. Suddenly, your helpful knowledge is reinterpreted as evidence of something sinister. Your healing herbs become a sorcerer's potions. Your quiet, solitary nature becomes proof of secretive, nocturnal dealings. What kind of evidence could be used against you? Almost anything if viewed through a lens of fear and suspicion. If you owned a black cat, a common companion but later associated with witches' familiars, that could be noted. If you were seen muttering to yourself, perhaps praying or just thinking aloud, it could be twisted into incantations. If you had a mole or a birthmark in an unusual place, it might later be interpreted as a witch's mark, a spot where your demonic familiar supposedly suckled. Remember the ordeal of cold water we discussed? That was a classic test for witches. If you floated, the pure water was rejecting you, therefore guilty. This reliance on dubious signs and coerced confessions is a key historical fact regarding witchcraft accusations. Unlike a theft where there might be stolen goods or an assault where there might be visible injuries, the crime of witchcraft was often invisible, its effects attributed rather than directly observed. This made it incredibly hard to defend against. How do you prove you didn't cause Farmer Giles's cow to go dry through a malevolent curse? How do you demonstrate you didn't fly off to a witch's sabbath on a broomstick? A later, more elaborate folkloric element, but the idea of secret, nefarious gatherings was present. The burden of proof was effectively reversed. You were presumed guilty and had to somehow prove an impossible negative. A quirky and terrifying aspect of some witchcraft beliefs was the idea of the evil eye, or malocchio. If you were believed to possess the evil eye, a simple glance, especially if accompanied by envy or ill will, could supposedly cause harm, sickness, or misfortune. Imagine being accused of blighting someone's crops or making their child ill simply by looking at them in a way someone else interpreted as malevolent. There's no defense against that kind of accusation, rooted as it is in pure superstition and subjective interpretation. People might genuinely believe you had harmed them, even if your only crime was looking a bit grumpy that morning. The Church's official position on witchcraft evolved over the medieval period. In the earlier centuries, some theologians were actually quite sceptical, sometimes viewing belief in witchcraft as a pagan superstition itself. However, by the later Middle Ages, particularly with the rise of inquisitorial procedures and influential texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, in the late 15th century, though its main impact was later, the idea of witchcraft as a diabolical conspiracy against Christendom gained more traction. This provided a theological framework for prosecuting witches with greater zeal. Historians still argue about the extent and nature of witchcraft, practices themselves versus the prosecution of alleged witches. Were there genuinely organised groups practicing pre-Christian rites, or was it mostly isolated folk healers and unlucky individuals caught up in local panics and scapegoating? The consensus among most modern scholars is that large-scale, organised diabolical witchcraft, as described in some texts, was largely a construct of the persecutors, not a reality. However, folk magic and attempts to use supernatural means for personal ends, both benevolent and malevolent, were certainly part of the medieval worldview. So if you find yourself on the receiving end of such an accusation, your options are terrifyingly limited. Denials are often taken as further proof of your cunning and deception. Of course, a witch would deny it. If you confess, perhaps under duress, torture, or simply out of despair and a desire for the ordeal to end, you confirm your guilt and likely face execution, probably by burning, as witchcraft was seen as a form of heresy. If you remain defiant, you might be subjected to various tests, or even torture to extract a confession. Remember, this isn't just about what you did, it's about what people believe you did, or what they believe you are. Your reputation, your social standing, any past grievances, all can be fuel for the fire of accusation. If you're already an outsider, someone a bit different, or someone who has had a run of bad luck that has also affected others, you are particularly vulnerable. The fear of the unknown, the need for an explanation for misfortune, and the power of communal paranoia could easily coalesce into a witchcraft accusation that would be almost impossible to survive with your life and reputation intact. Your alleged crime isn't just against your neighbour, it's against God and the entire natural order, making it one of the most dangerous charges imaginable in medieval England. No matter how petty or personal your crime might seem to you, whether it's that stolen chicken, a heated brawl in the alehouse, or even something more serious like robbery, in the eyes of medieval English law, you haven't just wronged an individual. You've committed a far graver offence. You have broken the king's peace. This concept was absolutely central to medieval justice. The king was considered the ultimate guarantor of order and stability throughout the realm. Therefore, any significant criminal act was seen not just as an offence against the victim, but as a direct affront to the monarch's authority and his duty to maintain peace and good governance. This elevated your crime from a local squabble to a matter of royal concern and invited the potentially severe wrath of the crown. The idea of the king's peace, Pax Regis, evolved from older Germanic notions that a chieftain or king was responsible for maintaining order within his territory. In Anglo-Saxon England, certain times, like religious festivals, and places like churches or the king's own highways had a special peace. After the Norman conquest, this concept was gradually extended until by the High Middle Ages, the king's peace was considered to cover the entire kingdom at all times. Any felony was thus an act against this overarching royal authority. Indictments, formal accusations, would typically state that the crime was committed against the peace of our Lord the King, his crown and dignity. This phrasing wasn't just a legal formality, it carried real weight. This meant that even if your victim was willing to forgive you, or if you managed to make private restitution, the Crown could still prosecute you. Crime was no longer just a private matter between individuals or families, as it had been to a greater extent in earlier feud-based societies. It was a public wrong, an offence against the state, embodied in the person of the king. This shift is a crucial historical fact in the development of English criminal law. It centralised justice under royal authority and laid the foundations for a more state-controlled legal system. So, when you're cowering in the jail or facing your accusers in court, it's not just Dame Agnes whose prize-winning parsnips you, allegedly, purloined that you have to worry about. It's the long arm and the even longer memory of the king's justice. This royal interest in your crime had several practical consequences. Firstly, it meant that royal officials, sheriffs, coroners, travelling justices, justices in air, were involved in the detection, apprehension, and trial of serious offenders. Justice wasn't left entirely to local communities, though they played a vital role as we've seen. The king had his representatives on the ground. Secondly, the penalties for crimes committed against the king's peace could be severe, precisely because they were seen as a challenge to royal authority. Treason, as we've discussed, was the ultimate crime against the king and was punished with utmost brutality. But even lesser felonies could attract harsh sentences if they were seen as particularly disruptive to public order, or if they involved any defiance of royal officials. For example, assaulting a tax collector or resisting arrest by the sheriff's men would be viewed very dimly indeed. A quirky, but illustrative, manifestation of the king's peace concerned the royal forests. These vast tracts of land were set aside for the king's personal hunting and leisure. The forest law that applied within these areas was exceptionally strict and operated largely outside the common law. Killing a deer in a royal forest wasn't just poaching, it was a direct infringement on the king's exclusive rights and a breach of his specific peace within that forest. Punishments could range from heavy fines to mutilation, like blinding or chopping off fingers to prevent future, archery, or even death, especially for repeat offenders. Remember the tales of Robin Hood defying the Sheriff of Nottingham in Sherwood Forest? That narrative taps directly into the popular resentment of the harsh forest law and its protection of the king's deer over the needs of his people. It highlights how seriously the king's personal domain and his peace were guarded. Historians still argue about the primary motivation behind the vigorous assertion of the king's peace. Was it a genuine desire for a more orderly and just society? Or was it more about consolidating royal power and increasing royal revenues? The fines, fees, and forfeitures of property from convicted criminals went, by and large, into the king's coffers or to his appointed lords. So, there was a strong financial incentive for the crown to take a keen interest in the prosecution of crime. Justice could be profitable. Perhaps it was a mixture of both. A more peaceful kingdom was a more governable and taxable kingdom. Think about the implications for you. The lowly criminal, your act, which you might have thought was a minor local affair, suddenly has national significance. The king, a distant and powerful figure you've probably never seen, is, in a legal sense, your ultimate victim and your ultimate judge. This elevates the stakes considerably. It means that you can't just rely on smoothing things over with your immediate neighbours or the local lord, though local influence certainly still mattered. You're now caught in a system that serves the interests of a far greater power. This concept also helps explain why certain crimes were prosecuted with more vigour than others. Offences that directly challenged royal authority, such as counterfeiting the king's coin, which was treated as treason, or those that threatened the economic interests of the crown, like smuggling, which deprived the king of customs revenue, were pursued relentlessly. Your petty theft might get you into trouble locally, but if your crime touched upon the king's revenue or his sovereign rights, you could expect the full weight of royal justice to descend upon you. So, as you stand accused, remember that the invisible presence in the courtroom, Alongside the judge and jury is the king himself. His peace has been shattered by your actions, and his justice system is there to restore it, often in a way that makes an example of you. This understanding adds another layer of dread to your already precarious situation. You're not just a local troublemaker, you're a peacebreaker on a royal scale, and the consequences are scaled accordingly. You're in custody, the weight of the king's peace pressing down on you. The evidence against you might be flimsy, perhaps just the suspicious glances of your neighbours, or the unfortunate discovery of a single incriminating chicken feather on your boots. In a modern courtroom, you'd have the right to remain silent, to not incriminate yourself. Your lawyer would advise you to say nothing until a proper defence could be mounted. But this is medieval England, and the concept of a right to silence as you understand it is a distant dream. In fact, not only did you not have a right to silence, but confessions were highly valued and often extracted through means that were dubious, persuasive, and at times downright painful. The medieval justice system placed great emphasis on obtaining a confession. A confession was seen as the queen of proofs, the gold standard of evidence. If the accused admitted their guilt, it simplified the entire judicial process. It removed the need for a lengthy trial, the uncertainty of a jury verdict, or the messy business of an ordeal in the earlier period. A confession, freely given, was considered clear evidence of guilt, paving the way for swift judgment and punishment. The problem, of course, lay in that little word, freely. While formal judicial torture to extract confessions in common law trials was not officially sanctioned in England in the same way it was in some continental European systems, at least not until later periods for specific crimes like treason, and even then often under a royal warrant. The lines could be blurry, especially in the pre-trial phase or in less formal settings. The pressure to confess could be immense, even without overt physical torture. Consider your situation in the jail. As we discussed, conditions were appalling. You're cold, hungry, possibly sick, and terrified. The jailer, whose income depends on fees, might suggest that a quick confession could lead to a speedier trial and an end to your current misery. He might hint that the judge looks more favourably on those who own up to their crimes. This kind of psychological pressure, preying on your desperation, could be very effective in eliciting a voluntary confession. Is it truly free if given to escape the hellhole of the jail? Furthermore, during the trial itself, you, the accused, were expected to answer questions directly. There was no lawyer to speak for you in most felony cases. You had to plead guilty or not guilty yourself. If you pleaded not guilty, you might still be questioned by the judge or even the jurors. Silence or evasiveness could be interpreted very negatively, as a sign of guilt or defiance. The expectation was that an innocent person would vigorously deny the charges and be able to explain themselves. If you stumbled, contradicted yourself, or seemed too cowed to speak, it could weigh heavily against you. This brings us to a crucial historical fact: the infamous peine forte dure, strong and hard punishment. This was a specific form of coercion used if an accused felon refused to plead either guilty or not guilty when arraigned before the court. By refusing to plead, they technically couldn't be tried by a jury. To force a plea, the accused would be subjected to pressing. They would be laid on their back, and heavy weights, stones or iron, would be placed upon their chest, increasing gradually day by day, with only a morsel of bread and a sip of stagnant water on alternate days. The aim was to force them to enter a plea. If they persisted in their silence and died under the weights, they died unconvicted. This had a grim advantage for their family. Because they weren't formally convicted of a felony, their property would not be forfeit to the crown but could pass to their heirs. Some individuals, knowing their guilt and the certainty of conviction and execution and subsequent forfeiture, chose this agonizing death to preserve their family's inheritance. It's a horrific choice, a slow, crushing death to protect your loved one's future. The last recorded use of peine forte dure in England was in the 18th century. A quirky, or rather disturbing tidbit concerning confessions relates to the approver system. An approver was a person accused of a felony who confessed their guilt and then offered to give evidence against their former accomplices, to appeal them, accuse them formally. If their appeals led to the conviction of these other individuals, the approver might receive a pardon and save their own life. This created a strong incentive for accused criminals to confess and implicate others, whether truthfully or not. Imagine being in a gang of thieves. One of your number gets caught and, to save his own skin, confesses and names you as an accomplice, perhaps exaggerating your role or even inventing your involvement in other crimes. His confession, even if self-serving and potentially false regarding your involvement, could be enough to get you arrested and put on trial. It was a system ripe for betrayal and false accusations. Historians still argue about the prevalence and legality of informal coercion or private torture used to extract confessions outside the formal court setting, perhaps by local lords or overzealous officials before a suspect was handed over to the royal courts. While English law prided itself on not officially sanctioning torture in common trials, like some continental systems, such as the Roman canon law inquisitorial procedure, the reality on the ground, far from the oversight of Westminster, might have been different. The line between harsh imprisonment designed to break your will and outright torture could be very thin indeed. So when you're facing your accusers, remember that silence is not golden. It's deeply suspicious. The entire system is geared towards you speaking, towards you confessing. The psychological torment of imprisonment, the direct questioning in court, the threat of peine forte et dure if you refuse to plead, and the temptation of becoming an approver if you have accomplices. All these factors conspire against your ability to simply keep quiet. Your words, or lack thereof, can seal your fate. A cleverly worded denial might plant a seed of doubt, but a flustered, incoherent response, or a confession blurted out in a moment of fear or despair, could be all the court needs to send you to the gallows or the maiming block. The pressure to speak, and to speak in a way that satisfies the court, is immense. In this world, your tongue can be either your salvation or your damnation. You're deep in the medieval legal quagmire. Perhaps you're languishing in jail awaiting trial, or maybe a guilty verdict has been handed down, and the shadow of the executioner or the mutilator looms large. Desperation sets in. Is there any way to tip the scales of justice in your favour, to find a crack in this seemingly relentless system? In a world where official salaries were often meagre and power could be wielded with little oversight, one potential, albeit dangerous and unreliable, avenue might present itself: bribery. The corrupt coin of justice could sometimes, just sometimes, sway outcomes, but it was a perilous game to play. The medieval administrative and judicial system, while having its formal structures, was also deeply personal. Justice was dispensed by individuals, sheriffs, jailers, jurors, even judges, who, like anyone, could be susceptible to temptation, especially if they were poorly paid or simply greedy. If you or your family and friends on the outside had sufficient resources, you might attempt to use wealth to influence the process at various stages. Consider the jailer. As we've discussed, he often ran the jail as a private enterprise, his income derived from fees. For a price, he might be persuaded to provide you with better food, cleaner straw, or even looser chains. For a larger sum, he might accidentally leave a door unlocked, allowing an escape, though this was a high-risk strategy for both you and him, as he'd face severe punishment if caught. More subtly, he might pass messages to your family, help you contact potential witnesses, or even speak a quiet word in your favour to those higher up the chain, if he thought it was in his interest. Remember the jailers who supposedly taught the neck verse for a fee? That's a small example of this kind of petty corruption. Then there are the jurors, those 12 neighbours deciding your fate. They were ordinary men, often farmers or artisans, not wealthy nobles. A strategically offered gift, a few shillings, a couple of sheep, a promise of future favours, might encourage them to view your case more sympathetically or to have reasonable doubts about your guilt. This was, of course, highly illegal, an offence called embracery, attempting to corrupt a jury, and risky. If discovered, both you and the juror could face severe penalties, but in a small community where everyone knew each other, such transactions could sometimes be managed discreetly. A little something to thank you for your time and trouble, good sir, in considering my unfortunate cousin's case. Even officials higher up the chain were not always immune. Sheriffs, as we noted, had a reputation for being grasping. They had considerable power over who was arrested, how vigorously a fugitive was pursued, and the conditions of confinement in the county jail. A well-placed bribe might ensure you weren't pursued too enthusiastically, or that certain evidence disappeared. This is a key historical fact. The potential for corruption was a known weakness in the medieval administrative system. Royal ordinances and statutes were frequently issued throughout the period attempting to stamp out corruption among officials, which ironically highlights how persistent the problem must have been. If they kept making laws against it, it means it kept happening. A quirky, or perhaps just deeply cynical aspect of this is that sometimes the appearance of justice was maintained even when bribery was at play. A judge might still deliver a stern lecture from the bench, condemning your alleged crimes in the strongest terms, before finding a technicality on which to acquit you, or passing a surprisingly lenient sentence, all after his palm had been suitably greased in private. It allowed the system to appear to be working, while still accommodating the influence of wealth. This sort of thing was more likely with powerful nobles who could offer substantial inducements, rather than for a common chicken thief, but the principle was there. However, playing the bribery game was fraught with peril. Firstly, you needed the resources. Most common criminals were, by definition, not wealthy. If you were already stealing to survive, you probably didn't have a secret hoard of silver to start bribing officials. Secondly, there was no guarantee it would work. You could offer a bribe, only to have the official take your money and then condemn you anyway, perhaps even more harshly to show he couldn't be bought, after, of course, pocketing your coin. Or worse, he might report your attempt to bribe him, adding another charge to your list. It was a gamble based on judging the character and greed of the person you were trying to corrupt. Historians still argue about how widespread and systematic corruption was in the medieval justice system. Some portray a system riddled with bribery from top to bottom, where justice was routinely bought and sold. Others argue that while corruption certainly existed, many officials took their duties seriously, and the system had enough checks and balances, like the travelling royal justices who could investigate local abuses, to prevent it from becoming entirely dysfunctional. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Opportunities for corruption were certainly there, and undoubtedly exploited by some, but it wasn't necessarily the norm in every case or every locality. Imagine your family, desperate to save you. They scrape together their meagre savings, perhaps sell a prized possession, all to offer a sum to the surly-looking bailiff or the foreman of the jury. The anxiety of that transaction, the fear of refusal, of betrayal, of losing their money for nothing, would be immense. And even if the bribe is accepted, there's the agonizing wait to see if it has the desired effect. Will the key witness suddenly change their testimony? Will the jury come back with an unexpected not guilty? Or will the money simply vanish, along with your last hope? The corrupt coin could occasionally offer a glimmer of hope in a dark situation, but it was an unreliable ally, a double-edged sword that could just as easily cut the one who wielded it. It underscores the inequality inherent in the system. If you were poor and friendless, you faced the full, unmitigated force of the law. If you had money and connections, you might, just might, be able to bend it or at least blunt its sharpest edges, but it was a dangerous, uncertain path, and for most everyday medieval criminals, the scales of justice were unlikely to be tipped by silver alone. You've run the terrible gauntlet of medieval English justice. Perhaps you were caught by the hue and cry, endured the squalor of the jail, faced a jury of neighbours who knew your every childhood mischief, and by some miracle, or perhaps the judicious application of a gift we just discussed, you've avoided the noose or the mutilator's axe. Maybe you were acquitted, or perhaps you received a lesser punishment, a fine, a public shaming in the stocks, or a whipping. You might think with a sigh of profound relief that your ordeal is finally over. You can go back to your life, pick up the pieces and try to forget the whole nightmare. But in the close-knit, reputation-obsessed world of medieval England, escaping the consequences of your brush with criminality wasn't nearly that simple. Your family, too, would bear the indelible stain of your actions, possibly for generations. This was the generational shame game, a long-lasting social punishment that extended far beyond any sentence handed down by a court. In a society where family name and reputation were paramount, the misdeeds of one individual could tarnish the entire kin group. Your conviction, or even just a serious accusation that stuck in the public memory, reflected not only on you but also on your parents, your siblings, your spouse, and your children. They would be known as the family of Wat the Thief, or the kin of Agnes the Scold. This label could affect their social standing, their marriage prospects, their ability to find good work, and even their own treatment within the community. Remember that village panopticon? It didn't just watch you, it watched everyone connected to you, and it had a very long memory. If your crime was particularly serious and resulted in you being declared an outlaw, a wolf's head, the consequences for your family were even more dire. As we touched upon, your property could be forfeit to the crown or the local lord. This could plunge your spouse and children into instant poverty, forcing them off their land and making them reliant on the charity of others, which might not be forthcoming given their association with an outlaw. Their lives would be forever blighted by your actions. Even if you died under peine forte dure to save their inheritance, the stigma would remain. This concept of collective family responsibility and inherited reputation is a key historical fact shaping social interactions in the medieval period. Lineage and honour were not just individual attributes, they were communal, familial possessions. An offence by one member could diminish the honour of the whole family, making it harder for them to maintain their place in the intricate social hierarchy. Other families might be reluctant to form alliances, like marriages, with a family tainted by criminality. Your children might find it difficult to secure apprenticeships or favourable land tenures because of your past. A quirky and rather sad illustration of this long-term social memory can be seen in some manorial court records, where disputes or minor offences are recorded. Sometimes, when a person is named, they are identified not just by their own name, but by reference to an infamous ancestor. John, son of William, grandson of Piers the Poacher. Even if Piers the Poacher had been dead for decades, his crime still clung to the family identity in the local records and presumably in local memory. It was a constant, quiet reminder of a past transgression, a shadow passed down through the generations. The church, while sometimes offering sanctuary or a path to penance, also reinforced this idea of sin having wider consequences. Confession and absolution might save your soul, but it didn't necessarily wipe the slate clean in the eyes of the community. Your family might still feel the need to make public displays of piety or engage in charitable acts to try and restore their reputation and distance themselves from your wrongdoing. Historians still argue about the degree to which social mobility was possible for families tainted by criminality. While medieval society was hierarchical, it wasn't entirely static. Could a family, through several generations of good conduct and perhaps some fortunate marriages or economic success, eventually overcome the stigma of a criminal ancestor? Possibly in some cases, but it would have been a long, arduous process, especially in a small, stable rural community where memories were long and gossip was a powerful social force. In larger towns or cities, anonymity might have been slightly easier to achieve over time, but the initial stain would still be a significant hurdle. Imagine returning to your village after serving your punishment. The averted gazes, the hushed conversations that stop when you approach, the reluctance of former friends to associate with you. These would be constant reminders of your fall from grace. And then, to see your children shunned in the village games, or your spouse treated with suspicion at the market, that would be a heavy burden to bear, a punishment that extended far beyond your own person. You might have paid your debt to the law, but paying your debt to society and to your family's reputation was another matter entirely. This generational shame was a powerful informal mechanism of social control. The fear of bringing dishonour and hardship upon one's family would have been a significant deterrent for many, perhaps even more so than the fear of official punishment. It reinforced the collective responsibility that was so characteristic of medieval communities. Your actions were never just your own. They rippled outwards, affecting everyone you were connected to. So, as you finally slip into what you hope is a peaceful slumber, remember this last, lingering consequence. Even if you survived your day as a criminal, the echoes of your misdeeds would resonate through your family's life for years, maybe even decades to come. The medieval world didn't easily forget, and it didn't easily forgive transgressions that threatened its delicate social fabric. The shame was a chain, binding one generation to the next. The night is drawing in now, and our rather grim exploration of medieval justice is coming to a close. We've seen how every aspect of that society, from the close-knit villages and the ever-watchful eyes of your neighbours to the rudimentary and often brutal methods of law enforcement and punishment, was stacked against anyone foolish enough to step outside the bounds of the law. The chances of you, with your modern sensibilities and expectations of due process, lasting even a single day without being caught, accused, and subjected to some rather unpleasant consequences, were slim indeed. The village panopticon, the hue and cry, the the clumsy constable, the sheriff's shoddy posse, the terrifying ordeals or the biased juries, the horrors of the jail, the stark choices of mutilation or public execution, the lonely end of outlawry, and the pervasive stain of generational shame. It all paints a rather bleak picture for the aspiring medieval miscreant. But as you drift off to sleep, perhaps take some comfort in the fact that you are here, safe in your own time, where justice, for all its imperfections, operates under a very different set of rules. The world we've visited tonight is one of the past, a place to explore with curiosity and perhaps a little shiver of unease, but not one we have to inhabit. Let the sounds of that distant, harsher world fade away, replaced by the quiet hum of your fan, the gentle rustle of your sheets. May your dreams be peaceful, free from the clamour of the hue and cry, and filled with the reassurance that you are secure, and that the long, often brutal arm of medieval law cannot reach you here. Rest now, and let the darkness be a comforting blanket.